The gunshot shattered the silence like a curse, and Clara O'Sullivan knew she was out of time. Her boots pounded the cracked earth of Dead Man's Canyon, lungs burning as she clutched the heavy satchel to her chest. Its contents worth more than her life, but not as much as the secret she carried. Behind her, the thunder of hooves grew louder, the men's laughter sharp as knives. "Run all you want, darlin'," one of them taunted, his voice slithering through the dark. "You know how this ends." She didn't look back. She couldn't, because if she did, she'd see the faces of the men who'd owned her, used her, and left her with scars no one could see. The canyon walls loomed like prison bars, the moon a cold witness to her desperation. Then, hoofbeats, not theirs, closer, faster. A rider emerged from the shadows, his silhouette sharp against the blood-red sky. "Get on," he growled, his voice rough as gravel, his hand outstretched. Clara hesitated. This man was a stranger. A killer, maybe. But the choice was simple. Trust him, or die here. She grabbed his hand. The moment her fingers touched his, everything changed. Because the men chasing her weren't just after the satchel. They were after her. And the rider? He wasn't just a savior. He was the one man who knew exactly what she'd done, and why they'd never stop hunting her. The horse lunged forward, and Clara's last thought before the darkness swallowed them was this: he knows. And that made him more dangerous than the devils on their trail. If you love stories where the past is a prison and love is the only escape, hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Secrets, because this ride is just beginning. The rider didn't slow until the canyon walls had swallowed the sound of pursuit, until the only thing Clara could hear was the ragged gasp of her own breath and the relentless pound of the stallion's hooves. His grip on her wrist was iron, his body tense as a drawn bowstring, every muscle coiled with the kind of readiness that came from years of running, or hunting. She didn't know which one he was, didn't dare ask. Not yet. The horse finally stumbled to a stop in a narrow gulch, its sides heaving, its breath steaming in the cold night air. Clara slid off before the stranger could help her, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. The satchel, her lifeline, was still clutched against her chest, its weight a constant reminder of what she'd stolen, of what she'd done. The man dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the brittle brush. He was tall, his frame lean but hard, the kind of build that spoke of long nights in the saddle and fights that left scars deeper than skin. A faded duster coat hung from his shoulders, the hem stained with dust and something darker. Blood, maybe. His face was all sharp angles in the moonlight, high cheekbones, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that gleamed like flint. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against his sun-bronzed skin. Clara's fingers twitched toward the revolver tucked into her belt. He noticed, of course he did. His gaze flicked to the movement, then back to her face, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You planning to use that?" His voice was low, rough, the kind of voice that made her think of whiskey and gunsmoke. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her pulse still hammering from the chase. The man stepped closer, and she forced herself to stand her ground, even as her instincts screamed to run. He reached out, not for her, but for the satchel. "Give it here." The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of a threat. Clara recoiled, pressing the bag tighter against her. "No." The word came out stronger than she felt. His eyes narrowed. "You're bleeding." She glanced down. A dark stain was spreading across the sleeve of her dress, the fabric stuck to a shallow gash on her arm. She hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing. It's not nothing," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "And neither is whatever's in that bag. You stole from the wrong people, chica." The way he said it, like he already knew, like he'd been waiting for her, sent a chill down her spine. "Who are you?" she demanded. He ignored the question, his gaze locked on the satchel. "Darius Cole's mark is on that bag, which means you're either very brave or very stupid." Clara's breath hitched. Darius Cole. Just the name made her skin crawl. The leader of the Serpent's Hand, the man who'd taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, who'd given her food and shelter and then slowly, methodically, turned her into something she barely recognized. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. The stranger's expression darkened. Nobody ever does. He turned abruptly, rummaging in his saddlebag before tossing her a canteen and a strip of cloth. Clean it up. We're not done riding. Clara caught the canteen, her fingers trembling. Where are we going? Someplace they won't find you. At least not tonight. He didn't offer more, just turned his back to her, giving her the illusion of privacy as she tended to her wound. The water stung, but she didn't flinch. She'd endured worse. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her, his arms crossed, his stance unyielding. You're not just running from them, he said. You're running from something else. It wasn't a question. Clara's grip tightened on the canteen. What's your name? She asked again, desperate to steer the conversation away from the past she'd spent years trying to outrun. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then finally, Elias Carter. The name settled between them, heavy with meaning she didn't understand. And you? He prompted. Clara. Just Clara. No last name, no history, no ties to the woman she'd been before. Elias nodded, as if he'd expected as much. Well, Clara, you've got two problems now. One, Darius Cole doesn't let go of what's his, and two... He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know what you took. Her breath caught. What? The ledger, he said, his eyes boring into hers. The one with all the names. Clara's blood turned to ice. The ledger was supposed to be a secret, a way out, a weapon. But if Elias knew about it... How? She demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He tossed it to her. Clara caught it, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a page from the ledger. Her page, the one with her name at the top, the one that listed every debt, every crime, every sin Darius had forced her to commit. You've been carrying that around? She asked, her voice hollow. I've been looking for it, he corrected, and now I've found you. The air between them crackled with tension, thick with unspoken questions. Clara's mind raced. Elias wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't just a rider who'd pulled her from the jaws of death. He was something worse, something dangerous. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why help me? Elias's gaze darkened. Because I know what it's like to have Darius Cole own your soul. The way he said it, the raw, bitter edge to his voice, made her stomach twist. And? She pressed. What do you want from me? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, deadly calm. I want the same thing you do. What's that? To burn it all down. The words hung between them, heavy with promise and peril. Clara looked at the ledger in her hands, then back at Elias. He was offering her a choice, a chance. But trust didn't come easy. Not for her. Not for a man like him. And yet, as the wind howled through the canyon and the shadows of their pursuers lingered just beyond the darkness, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't do this alone. Elias turned away, mounting his horse with fluid ease. We ride at dawn, he said. Get some rest. Clara watched him disappear into the makeshift shelter of a nearby overhang, her mind spinning. She should have run. Should have taken her chances in the dark. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The weight of the ledger. The ghost of Elias's words. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility that she might not be alone in this fight after all. She unfolded the cloth he'd given her, pressing it to her arm. Her gaze fixed on the firelight dancing against the canyon walls. The ledger was a ticking bomb. Darius would kill to get it back. And Elias? She still didn't know what he wanted. If he was her salvation or her ruin. But as the first hints of gray light crept over the horizon, Clara made her decision. She tucked the ledger back into the satchel, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her revolver. She wasn't running anymore. Not from Darius. Not from her past. And certainly not from the man who'd just handed her a match. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Clara finally let herself sleep. but her rest was shallow, fractured by the kind of dreams that clung like cobwebs, dark, sticky, impossible to shake. She saw Darius's face, his cold smile as he pressed the ledger into her hands and whispered, "This is your insurance, darling. And your prison." She saw the men she'd helped ruin, their names scrawled in her own trembling hand. And then there was Elias, his scarred face hovering at the edge of her consciousness, his voice a low growl. "We burn it all down." She woke with a start, her hand flying to the revolver at her hip, her heart hammering against her ribs. The canyon was silent, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke. Elias was already awake, crouched by the dead fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He didn't look up as she sat, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. Men like him always were. "You sleep like a woman with ghosts," he said, his voice rough with the weight of the early morning. Clara didn't answer. She rubbed her arms, trying to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The ledger was still tucked safely in her satchel, but it might as well have been burning a hole through the leather. She could feel its pull, the way it whispered promises and threats in equal measure. "We should talk about what happens next," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Elias didn't stop sharpening the knife. "Next is simple. We ride to Black Ridge, find a man named Harlan. He'll get us what we need." "And what's that?" "Leverage." The word hung between them, sharp as the blade in his hands. Clara's stomach twisted. Leverage for what? Elias finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "To make sure Darius Cole never comes after you again." She should have felt relief, should have felt hope. But all she felt was the weight of the ledger pressing against her ribs, the names inside it screaming in her memory. "You're not just talking about burning the ledger," she said slowly. "You're talking about burning him." Elias didn't deny it. He just stood, wiping the blade clean on his thigh before sliding it into his boot. Some men don't deserve second chances. Clara swallowed hard. She'd seen what Darius was capable of, had been complicit in it, once. But the idea of crossing that line, of becoming the kind of monster she'd spent years trying to escape, made her skin crawl. "And if we fail?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias's expression darkened. "Then we die trying." The bluntness of it should have terrified her. Maybe it did. But there was something else, too. Something like admiration. Or maybe just the desperate, foolish hope that she wasn't as alone as she'd always believed. They rode hard all morning, sticking to the high ground where the land was rocky and the trails were thin. Elias kept them moving at a pace that left Clara's thighs aching and her hands numb from gripping the reins. But she didn't complain. The fear of what was behind them was a far worse burden than the pain of the ride. By midday, the terrain had shifted, the canyon walls giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional skeletal tree. The air smelled of sage and distant rain, but the tension between them was thicker than the dust kicking up from the horse's hooves. "There," Elias said suddenly, reining in his horse. Clara followed his gaze. Nestled in the valley below was a cluster of buildings. Black Ridge, if the faded sign swaying in the wind was to be believed. It wasn't much. A saloon, a general store, a handful of ramshackle houses clinging to the edge of the desert like they were afraid of being swallowed whole. "Harlan's place is the saloon," Elias said, his voice low. "We go in, we get what we need, we get out. No mistakes." Clara nodded, but her fingers tightened around the reins. "What exactly are we getting?" Elias hesitated, just for a second. "A name." "Whose?" "Someone who can make Darius Cole disappear." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. "You're talking about killing him." Elias's jaw clenched. "I'm talking about justice." "Justice?" Clara's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "You think that's justice? After everything he's done, everything I've done?" She cut herself off, her breath coming fast. Elias turned in his saddle, his eyes locking onto hers with a ferocity that stole her words. "What did he make you do, Clara?" The question hung between them, raw and bleeding. Clara looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant town. She could still see the faces of the men she'd helped ruin. The way their eyes had dulled when they realized what was coming. The way Darius had laughed, clapping her on the back like she was his prized pupil. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "You do now." Elias's voice was quiet, but it cut through her like a blade. Clara closed her eyes, the weight of the ledger pressing against her chest like a brand. She'd spent so long running, so long surviving, that she'd forgotten what it was like to choose. And now, with the chance finally in her hands, she wasn't sure she knew how. The saloon was exactly the kind of place Clara had spent years avoiding. Dark, stale with the scent of cheap whiskey and cheaper perfume. The air thick with the hum of low voices and the occasional clink of a glass. The moment they stepped inside, every head turned. Elias didn't flinch. He strode to the bar like he owned the place, his hand resting easy on the butt of his revolver. Clara followed, her pulse hammering in her throat. The bartender was a grizzled man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Didn't think I'd see you back here." "Harlan," Elias replied, nodding. "We need to talk." Harlan's gaze flicked to Clara, lingering on the way she stood just a little too close to Elias, the way her fingers twitched toward the revolver at her hip. "Private talk?" "Very." Harlan jerked his chin toward a door at the back of the room. 5 minutes. Then you're gone." The back room was small, the air thick with the scent of gun oil and old paper. Harlan shut the door behind them, leaning against it with his arms crossed. "You're asking for trouble, boy," he said, his eyes on Clara. "Darius Cole's trouble." Elias didn't look away. "I'm asking for a name. And if I don't give it to you, then I start burning this town down one building at a time until you do." Harlan's laugh was a dry, humorless sound. "You always were a dramatic bastard." He reached into his coat and tossed a folded slip of paper onto the table between them. "That's your name, but you didn't get it from me." Elias unfolded the paper. Clara leaned in, her breath catching as she read the name scrawled in Harlan's jagged handwriting. Judge Silas Boone. "Boone?" she repeated, her voice hollow. "He's the one who signs Darius's warrants. The one who makes his deals legal." Elias's expression was grim. "And now he's going to make sure Darius Cole never sees the inside of a courtroom again." Clara's stomach twisted. "You're talking about blackmail." "I'm talking about survival." Elias's gaze was unyielding. "You in or out, Clara?" She looked at the name on the paper, then at Elias. This was it, the point of no return. If they did this, there was no going back. No more running, no more hiding. Just blood and fire, and the terrifying, exhilarating chance at something like freedom. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against the paper. "I'm in." Harlan let out a low whistle. "God help you both." But as Clara met Elias's eyes, she realized something for the first time in years. She wasn't praying for help. She was praying for strength. What would you do in Clara's place? Trust a man like Elias to burn the world down with you? Or run before the flames consume you both? Drop your answer in the comments. The ride to Blackridge County Courthouse was a silent march toward the gallows. Clara's fingers hadn't stopped trembling since they'd left Harlan's saloon, the name Judge Silas Boone burning in her mind like a brand. She'd heard the stories, whispers in the dark corners of Darius's stronghold about the man who turned a blind eye to murder, who stamped official seals on warrants written in blood. A judge who wasn't just corrupt, but untouchable. And now, she and Elias were walking straight into his den. Elias didn't speak as they tethered the horses behind the courthouse, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the streets like a wolf scenting a trap. The town was too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Clara could feel it in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the prickle of danger crawling up her spine. "We go in fast," Elias muttered, his voice barely above a growl. "Get what we need. Get out." Clara nodded, but her stomach twisted. This wasn't just about the ledger anymore. This was about her, about the names she'd written, the lives she'd helped ruin. If they failed, Darius wouldn't just kill them, he'd make sure they begged for it first. The courthouse loomed ahead, its whitewashed walls peeling under the relentless sun, its windows dark as a hangman's hood. Elias pushed open the door, the hinges groaning like a dying man's last breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale tobacco. A clerk looked up from his desk, his eyes widening as he took in Elias's scarred face and the way Clara's hand hovered over her revolver. "The judge in?" Elias demanded. The clerk swallowed hard, nodding toward a door at the back of the room. "But he don't take kindly to—" Elias didn't let him finish. He strode past the desk, his boots thudding against the floorboards, Clara close behind. The door to Boone's office was closed. Elias didn't knock. He kicked it open, the wood splintering under his boot. Judge Silas Boone looked up from his desk, his face a mask of cold indifference, until his gaze landed on Clara. Recognition flickered in his eyes, sharp and ugly. "Well," he drawled, leaning back in his chair, "if it ain't Darius Cole's favorite little scribe." Clara's breath hitched. He knew. Of course he did. Darius had made sure of it. Elias stepped between them, his revolver drawn. "We're here for leverage, Boone." The judge's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And what makes you think I'd give you a damn thing?" "Because," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt, "if you don't, that ledger goes straight to the territorial marshal. And we both know what's in it." Boone's smile faded. The ledger was a noose around all their necks, his included. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Elias said, cocking the hammer of his revolver. The judge's gaze flicked to the gun, then back to Clara. "You always were a reckless little thing, Clara. Darius should have broken you of that." The words hit her like a slap. She could still hear Darius's voice in her head, his promises turning to threats, his hands. "Stop." Clara forced the memories down, meeting Boone's gaze with a defiance she didn't entirely feel. "Darius doesn't own me anymore." Boone let out a low, humorless laugh. "He owns us all, girl." Then, slowly, he reached into his desk and pulled out a thick envelope. "Take it," he said, tossing it onto the table. "But you mark my words. You burn Darius Cole, you burn with him." Elias snatched the envelope, his eyes never leaving Boone. "Pleasure doing business." They turned to leave, but Clara hesitated, her gaze locked on the judge. "Why help us?" she asked. Boone's expression was unreadable. "Because I'd rather watch Darius burn than dance on his strings." The word sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't mercy. It was survival. And survival in this world came with a price. They didn't speak until they were back on the horses, the courthouse shrinking in the distance. Elias opened the envelope, his expression darkening as he scanned the contents. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice tight. He handed her a sheet of paper. It was a warrant, not for an arrest, but for a land deed, one that bore Darius Cole's name, and the signature of a man who'd been dead for 10 years. "Boone's been forging documents," Elias said, his voice low. "Darius has been using them to steal land, blackmail officials." Clara's fingers tightened around the paper. "This is it," she breathed. "This is how we end him." Elias didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched. "We need to move fast," he said. "Darius will know we were here by sundown." Clara nodded, but her mind was racing. This was more than leverage. This was a weapon. One that could bring down not just Darius, but the entire Serpent's Hand. But weapons had a way of backfiring, and she'd seen what happened to people who stood in Darius's way. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits. The land blurred around them, the wind whipping at Clara's face, her thoughts a storm of fear and determination. They needed a plan, a place to strike. Somewhere Darius would never expect. "The old mill," Elias said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Outside of town. Darius uses it to move his shipments. If we hit him there, we hit him where it hurts." Clara's breath caught. The mill was a fortress, guarded by men who'd kill without hesitation. "We'll be outnumbered. We'll be unexpected," Elias countered. "And we'll have this." He held up the warrant, the paper fluttering in the wind. "Darius's empire is built on lies. We burn the lies, we burn the empire." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. The scar on his face. the hardness in his eyes. They weren't just from the fights he'd survived. They were from the choices he'd made. The same choices she was making now. "And if we fail?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "Then we take as many of them with us as we can." The words should have terrified her. Maybe they did. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Clara realized something. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of living, of carrying the weight of her past forever. And if this was her chance to finally lay it down, she'd take it, even if it burned her alive. They reached the mill just as the last light bled from the sky. The place was a hulking shadow against the twilight, its windows glowing with lantern light, the murmur of voices drifting on the wind. Elias dismounted, his movements silent, his revolver gleaming in the fading light. Clara followed, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "You ready?" Elias asked, his voice low. She met his gaze, her fingers tightening around her own weapon. "Let's burn it all down." The first shot rang out like the crack of doom. The mill doors burst open, men spilling out with guns drawn, their shouts lost in the chaos. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired, her aim true, her mind clear for the first time in years. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about justice. And justice, she'd learned, was a fire that consumed everything in its path. Elias moved like a shadow beside her, his revolver barking death with every pull of the trigger. The mill was a storm of gunfire and screaming, the air thick with smoke and the copper tang of blood. Clara ducked behind a stack of crates, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the chaos, she saw him, Darius Cole, standing in the doorway of the mill, his face a mask of cold fury. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Clara didn't look away. Darius smiled. "Hello, darling," he called, his voice cutting through the noise. "Miss me?" Elias saw him too. Saw the way Darius's hand hovered over his revolver, the way his gaze flicked between them, like he was already deciding who to kill first. "Clara," Elias growled, his voice a warning. But she was already moving, her boots kicking up dust as she stepped into the open, her revolver steady in her grip. Darius's smile widened. "There she is, my little scribe. Did you really think you could run from me?" Clara didn't answer. She fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough. Darius lunged for cover, his men scattering like cockroaches in the light. Elias cursed, grabbing her arm. "We need to go, now!" But Clara didn't move. She was done running. "Not yet," she said, her voice steady. "We end this tonight." Darius laughed from his cover, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "You always did have fire, Clara. Pity it's going to get you killed." Elias pulled her back, his face a mask of fury. "We don't have time for this." But Clara shook her head. "He's mine." The words tasted like venom and victory all at once, and as the mill burned behind them, the flames licking at the sky, she knew. This was the moment she'd been running toward her whole life. The question was no longer if she'd survive. It was if she'd be the one to pull the trigger. The mill was burning like hell itself had come to collect its due. Flames licked up the wooden walls, devouring the dry timber with a hunger that matched the fury in Clara's veins. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder, the crackle of fire drowning out the groans of the wounded, and the distant shouts of Darius's men scrambling in the chaos. Clara's fingers were slick with sweat around the grip of her revolver, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She could feel Elias beside her, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. His eyes locked on the figure emerging from the smoke like a demon summoned from the depths. Darius Cole stepped into the flickering light, his coat flapping around him like the wings of some great bird of prey. His face was a mask of cold amusement, his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice cutting through the noise of the inferno around them. "If it ain't my two favorite traitors." His gaze flicked from Elias to Clara, lingering on her with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. "Did you really think you could burn me, little scribe? After everything I gave you?" Clara's grip tightened on her revolver. You didn't give me anything. She spat, her voice raw with years of swallowed rage. You took, you broke, you made me into something I never wanted to be. Darius's smile widened, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, something like disappointment. I made you into a survivor, just like me. Elias stepped forward, his revolver leveled at Darius's chest. Enough talk. This ends tonight. Darius didn't flinch. He just laughed, low and mocking. You always were the impatient one, Elias. But you forget. I know you. I made you. The words hit like a bullet, and Clara saw Elias's jaw clench, the muscle in his cheek twitching. She didn't know what had passed between them, didn't know the history that bound them like chains. But she knew the way Elias's hand trembled, just slightly, as he kept his aim steady. You don't own me anymore, Elias growled. Darius's laughter died, his expression turning cold. We'll see about that. His hand twitched toward his own revolver, but before he could draw, Clara fired. The shot echoed like thunder, the bullet kicking up dust at Darius's feet. He froze, his eyes snapping to hers, his smile gone. Next one doesn't miss, she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Darius's gaze darkened. You don't have the stomach for this, girl. Try me, she shot back. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a snarl, Darius lunged. Clara fired again, but he was faster than she expected, twisting away as the bullet grazed his shoulder. Elias cursed, his finger tightening on the trigger, but before he could shoot, a gunshot rang out from the darkness. Elias staggered, a red stain blooming on his side. Clara's breath caught. Elias! She turned just in time to see him drop to one knee, his face twisted in pain, his revolver slipping from his fingers. Darius laughed, low and triumphant. Did you really think I'd come alone? From the shadows, his men emerged, their rifles trained on Clara. She swung her revolver toward them, but it was too late. One of them kicked it from her hand, sending it skittering across the dirt. Drop it, Clara, Darius ordered, his voice smooth as poison. This is over. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her eyes were locked on Elias, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hand pressed against the wound in his side. You're a fool, girl, Darius said, stepping closer. You could have had everything, power, safety, me. Clara's stomach twisted. I'd rather die, she spat. Darius's smile faded. Then die you will. He raised his revolver, the barrel pointed straight at her heart. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for the shot, but it never came. Instead, there was a roar, a blur of motion, and then Elias was between them, his body slamming into Darius with the force of a runaway train. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, Elias's hands closing around Darius's throat. You should have killed me when you had the chance, Elias snarled, his voice raw with fury. Clara didn't hesitate. She lunged for her revolver, her fingers closing around the grip, just as one of Darius's men grabbed her from behind. She twisted, driving her elbow into his ribs, and fired. The man crumpled, and she whirled, her revolver sweeping toward the others. Back off! She screamed, her voice hoarse. The men hesitated, their eyes flicking between her and the struggle on the ground. Darius was gasping, his face turning purple as Elias's hands tightened around his throat. Elias, stop! Clara shouted, but he didn't hear her. Or maybe he just didn't care. She took a step forward, her revolver still trained on Darius's men. Let him go, she ordered, her voice shaking. Now. The men lowered their weapons, their faces pale. Clara didn't take her eyes off them as she crouched beside Elias, her hand on his shoulder. Elias, she said, her voice softer now. It's over. Let him go. For a heartbeat she didn't think he would. Then, slowly, his fingers loosened. Darius gasped, sucking in great, ragged breaths as Elias staggered to his feet, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. Clara stood, her revolver still steady. Darius coughed, wiping blood from his lips as he glared up at her. You haven't won, he rasped. You've just signed your death warrant. Clara didn't flinch. No, she said, her voice cold. I've signed yours. She turned to Elias, her heart pounding. We need to go. Now. Elias didn't argue. He grabbed her hand and together they turned, leaving Darius and his men in the dust. The mill was a pyre behind them, the flames reaching for the sky like the fingers of the damned. Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she might see the truth in Darius's eyes, the truth that this wasn't over, that men like him never stayed down. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the night. Only then did Elias slow, pressing a hand to his side with a grimace. Clara stopped beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice tight with worry. Elias shook his head. "No doctors, no trails. We disappear." Clara nodded, but her mind was racing. Disappearing was easy. Staying gone, that was the hard part. Elias must have seen the doubt in her eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "We did it. We burned him." Clara wanted to believe him. But as she looked back at the distant glow of the fire, she knew the truth. Some fires didn't just burn out. They spread. And Darius Cole was the kind of fire that could consume the world. They found shelter in an abandoned miner's shack on the outskirts of town, the walls barely standing, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Clara helped Elias inside, her hands shaking as she pressed a strip of cloth against his wound. The blood seeped through the fabric, dark and relentless. "This is bad," she whispered, her throat tight. Elias gripped her wrist, his fingers strong despite the pain. "I've had worse." Clara wanted to argue, but she knew it was useless. Men like Elias didn't stop fighting, not even when death was breathing down their necks. She rummaged through her satchel, pulling out the ledger and the warrant they'd taken from Boone. The papers felt heavy in her hands, the names inside them screaming for justice. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the ledger, his expression unreadable. "We use it," he said finally. "We take it to the territorial marshal. We make sure Darius never sees the light of day again." Clara's stomach twisted. "And if the marshal's on his payroll?" Elias's jaw clenched. "Then we find someone who isn't." He looked at her, his eyes dark with determination. "We end this, Clara. Once and for all." Clara nodded, but her mind was a storm of doubt. They'd come so far, fought so hard. But the world didn't change just because you wanted it to. And men like Darius Cole didn't stay buried. She looked down at the ledger, at the names scrawled in her own handwriting. These were the lives she'd helped ruin, the sins she'd committed. And now, she was supposed to trust that the law, the very system that had failed them both, would make it right? Elias must have seen the hesitation in her eyes. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice soft. "You can walk away. Right now." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. The scar on his face, the pain in his eyes. They were mirrors of her own. She could walk away, could disappear into the night and never look back. But she'd been running her whole life, and she was tired. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm done running." Elias's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, his hand finding hers. "Then, we finish this together." Outside, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, the distant glow of the fire painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around Elias's. They had a plan. They had a chance. But as the shadows stretched long and the night closed in around them, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a cliff, and the fall was going to be a long one. The marshal's office in Blackridge smelled of old leather and lies. Clara's fingers trembled as she placed the ledger on the desk, the weight of the names inside pressing down on her like a tombstone. Marshal Thomas Graves looked up from the papers, his weathered face unreadable. "You understand what you're asking me to do," he said, his voice low. "Darius Cole isn't just a criminal. He's a storm." Elias stood beside her, his arm still bandaged from the bullet wound, his jaw set. "Then it's time someone stopped the rain," he replied, his voice steady. Graves exhaled sharply, flipping through the ledger's pages. The names stared back at them, men and women Darius had ruined, lands he'd stolen, lives he'd crushed. Clara's breath caught as her own name jumped out at her, scrawled in her own handwriting beside a list of crimes she'd been forced to commit. "You were part of this," Graves said, his gaze lifting to hers. "Why should I trust you?" Clara met his eyes, unflinching. "Because I'm the only one who knows where the bodies are buried." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Graves nodded. "I'll need your testimony. Both of you." Elias didn't hesitate. "You'll have it." Clara's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to nod. This was it. The moment she'd been running from her whole life. The moment she had to face the past and pray it didn't swallow her whole. 3 days later, the territorial courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled. Every face turned toward the front where Darius Cole stood, his hands cuffed, his expression cold as death. Clara sat in the witness box, her palms slick with sweat, her voice steady as she recounted every crime, every lie, every life Darius had destroyed. Elias was beside her, his presence a silent promise that she wasn't alone. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Darius had no smirk, no taunt, just a slow, burning hatred in his eyes as the judge read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The gavel fell like a gunshot. Darius was led away, his men scattered or arrested, his empire crumbling to dust. Clara should have felt triumphant. She should have felt free. But as she stepped out of the courthouse, the sun too bright, the air too clean, all she felt was the weight of what she'd done, and what she'd lost. Elias was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps, his hat in his hands, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. The scar on his face, the weariness in his eyes, they told a story she knew too well. "Is it?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't answer. He just reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here." They rode out of town as the sun set, the sky painted in hues of gold and crimson. The kind of beauty that felt like a wound. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was behind her, and for the first time in years, she could breathe. They stopped at a ridge overlooking the valley, the wind tugging at Clara's hair, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Elias dismounted, wincing slightly as his boot hit the ground. Clara followed, her heart pounding. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "Now?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. "Now, we start over." He opened it, revealing 2 train tickets, one to San Francisco, one to New Orleans. Clara's breath caught. "You're leaving." Elias hesitated, then shook his head. "Not without you." He held out the tickets, his hand steady. "Your choice, Clara. Always." She looked at the tickets, then at him. The man who'd saved her. The man who'd fought beside her. The man who'd given her a chance to be something more than a ghost. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "What if I don't want to choose?" she whispered. Elias's expression softened. "Then we find someplace new. Together." The words hung between them, fragile and full of promise. Clara looked out at the horizon, the endless stretch of land and sky, the future wide open before them. She'd spent so long running, so long hiding. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to live. She turned back to Elias, her decision made. "Together," she said, her voice steady. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in fire, she knew. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. What would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have trusted the law to bring down Darius Cole, or would you have taken justice into your own hands? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you love this wild ride of vengeance, redemption, and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-pounding tales from the untamed West.